Welcome to another bonus edition of Upon Further Review. And in this edition, we'll be talking about the Super Bowl, Super Bowl 49, between the New England Patriots and the Seattle Seahawks. And you can catch that at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time on February 1st, 2015. And that'll be aired on your local NBC affiliates. So you have the top two teams facing off in the Super Bowl. And for those of you that are not familiar with this program, Upon Further Review, what we do is we pick the team, and then I play it in Madden, the team that I'm picking to win. I'm picking the Patriots, so I'm playing as the Patriots, and you can watch the Madden highlights while I talk about the game, go over the stats and the schedule and the numbers, and break it down with some analysis and commentary. So let's get things going. So both of these teams were 12-4 during the regular season. They're both the number one seeds. The Patriots won the AFC East. The Seahawks won the NFC West. Both tough divisions. Really, the NFC West, though, is one of the tougher divisions in all of football, as they got the Cardinals and the Niners and the Rams, who are all good teams in their division. The Patriots had to deal with the Bills and the Dolphins, and even the Jets, although the Jets had a pretty abysmal record. But they both won their respective divisions, and they both had the best conference records, or the best records in their conference. The Patriots were 9-3 in the conference in the AFC. The Seahawks were 10-2 in their conference, the NFC. And let's look at actually how these teams performed, and let's look at their numbers. Usually we go over the schedules first, but let's just go right into the numbers. Let's dive right in, and let's look at passing production, passing proficiency, as we like to call it here on Upon Further Review. And when it comes to passing yards per game, the Patriots averaged 258 passing yards per game. The Seahawks averaged 203 passing yards per game. So the Patriots average over 50 more yards through the air. But let's look at their passing defense. And the Patriots allow 240 yards through the air, and the Seahawks only allow 186 yards through the air on average. So kind of similar to what they put up on offense is what they allow on defense. So the Patriots, they put up more yards through the air, but they also allow more yards through the air. And the Seahawks, much the same. They kind of struggle to put up yards through the air. Not a whole lot, just over 200, but they hold teams down, and they don't let them have passing production and really have much of a passing game against them, as they're very known. They're infamous as the Legion of Boom there in Seattle, one of the top secondaries in the NFL, if not the top secondary in the NFL, maybe one of the top secondaries ever to play in the NFL. Of course, we shall see how they perform in the Super Bowl, and that could go a long way towards cementing their legacy as a secondary. As we've seen last year in the Super Bowl, they shut down Peyton Manning, and that was Peyton Manning coming up off of his best season ever, where he broke the record for most passing yards and most passing touchdowns, only to be blown out in the Super Bowl by the Seahawks. Will that happen this year? I don't think it will. I'm picking the Patriots, as you can see on the screen there, as I'm playing as the Patriots. Of course, a little disclaimer, I am a little bit biased, as I was born in New England, so I've been a lifelong Patriots fan. I also am a fan of the Seahawks, but if you made me pick, obviously I'm going to pick New England. Although I'm trying not to be biased here and actually pick it somewhat down the middle, but that's going to be almost impossible, like I said, in any game the Patriots are playing. Although I do have a tremendous respect for the Seahawks, I really do. I like them too as a fan. I am a fan of the Seahawks. Not quite to the point of the Patriots. As I said, I was born in New England, so that's always going to be my team for life. But let's look at the running yards for both of these teams. And on offense, the Patriots average 108 yards per game, and the Seahawks average 173 yards. They were the number one rushing team in the NFL. So it's quite a lot of production on the ground, almost twice as much as the Patriots. And that's going to be a big key in this game. Is going to be the running game of both of these teams. Whoever's going to have success on the ground should be able to win the game, because that's going to go a long way towards the time of possession, and that's definitely a battle that you need to win this game. But we look at run defenses, and the Patriots allow a $104 on the ground, on average per game, and the Seahawks allow 82 yards on the ground on average per game. So although the Patriots do struggle to run the ball, they don't have a lot of running yards on average, even though they have been running the ball better lately. But they don't let teams really run too much against them. They only allow a buck 04. That's not too much. That's actually a pretty low number. The Seahawks, though, on the other hand, they just are one of the most dominant teams on the ground, whether it be on offense or on defense. Is they, beast mode Marshawn Lynch has been having a phenomenal season, second only to DeMarco Murray. But, as a team, the Seahawks put up more yards on the ground than the Cowboys. Of course, a lot of that has to do with Russell Wilson and his ability to extend plays with his legs and come out of the pocket and scramble. He's the number one quarterback, in terms of rushing yards. And he actually was 15th overall among all running, among all runners and among all rushing yards statistics. So right there, they have two of the top 15 rushers in the game, although one of them is behind center and also can, definitely cause some damage with his arm. So when it comes to the passing game, I got to give it to the Patriots. When it comes to the running game, I got to give it to the Seahawks. And their defense has actually been pretty overlooked when it comes to their run defense, because of how vaunted the Legion of Boom is and how successful they are and how successful they have been really for the last, I'd say 3-4 years, ever since, Sherman joined the team. They already had a decent secondary. Earl Thomas has been there. Then when they added Sherman, then they added Cam Chancellor, and then also Byron Maxwell. That's a pretty solid core. And they have good guys backing them up who are playing, the nickel and dime as well. But up front, though, that's where the big differences come in. They picked up Kevin Williams in the offseason, and all year long, it's actually throughout the first half of the season, it was their run defense that kept them competitive, that kept them in the hunt for the division title, even when they were, a few games back of the Cardinals, but they were able to claw their way back in it because they had solid run defense all year long. And then when their pass defense ended up, playing like you knew they would eventually, and they came on really strong in the second half, that's when their defense is actually at this point playing probably better than they were last year, which is kind of scary. Well, let's actually look and see for total yards on offense and defense. In the total yards, the Seahawks actually have an advantage by 10 yards. The Patriots average 366 yards. The Seahawks average 376 yards total offense. And then on defense, the Patriots allow 344 yards on defense. The Seahawks only allow 267 yards on defense average per game. So the Seahawks put up more yards and they allow a lot less. Considerably less. It's pretty close actually when you look at their offensive output. The Seahawks do it on the ground, the Patriots do it through the air, but when it comes to defense, the Seahawks definitely have the advantage. But let's look at the points, because that's the thing, is you can put up yards, but are you going to put up points, and are you going to stop teams from scoring? So when we look at the average points per game, the Patriots average 29.3 points per game, and the Seahawks average 24.6 points per game. So the Patriots average nearly 5 points more per game. That's almost 2 field goals. And then we look at the defense, and the Patriots allow 19.6, and the Seahawks allow 15.9. So the Seahawks allow nearly 4 points less. So that's kind of the differences you see right there. The Patriots score about 5 points more. Seahawks allow about 4 points less. If you do the math, that would pretty much equal out to the Patriots winning by 1 point. And that kind of goes along with my quick pick, if you had caught that, where I said that I believe that it'll come down to the end with Gostkowski kicking a late field goal in the fourth quarter, maybe even on the final play of the game, or even in overtime. It's quite possible. I wouldn't be shocked to see this game go to overtime. Although this game, anything could happen. We won't know until Sunday, but I think it's going to be very, tightly competitive, fiercely competitive, and tightly contested. But the thing is, when you look at the numbers in terms of the points, the Patriots, like I said, they put up a lot of points, but they don't allow too much. They allow a lot of yards, but they don't really allow a lot of points on the scoreboard. So they kind of have this bend but don't break mentality. The Seahawks, on the other hand, they're a team that will dominate you on defense, and then they'll put up enough points to win the game. And if you see, I mean, on average, both of these teams score on average close to 10 points more than they allow. You know, it's like 9.7 for the Patriots, and it's I think 9.6. No, 9.7 also. Is that right? Both of them 9.7 is the difference in how many points they put up on average over how many points they allow. So they definitely have been, they earned their spots as the number one teams, and that's how they did it, by scoring almost, double digits more than they allow. But that's where it's going to come down to is, will the Patriots, be able to put up points against the Seahawks? That's what I think it really comes down to in this game. Because you figure the Seahawks, if they put up what they usually put up, about 24, the Patriots allow about 20, 19.6. So if they can hold the Seahawks somewhere in that range about what they're, on average would put up, some like 21 to maybe, 24, 25, even though 25 is kind of an odd number, 24 is more likely, but just in terms of the way the game is played and scored. But what it's going to come down to, though, is will the Patriots be able to put up points against that Seahawks defense, and how quickly will they be able to do it? Will they be able to, take advantage and control the game clock with their running game, or are they going to be forced to win it through the air? And against that Legion of Boom, that's going to be rather difficult. Of course, at that point you figure, well, are they going to have to then attack the linebacking core? But the Seahawks linebacking core is pretty solid. I mean, they're loaded really up front. The whole defense is just loaded. It's out of control, but up front, they got guys that are backing up their guys that are almost as good as their starters, and to the point where with Seattle, a starter or backup is almost a moot, title, because of the frequency that they substitute with the different packages and with the talent that they have on the sidelines, especially on defense, is something that is pretty rare, and I don't think we've ever seen anything like it before. The Patriots, similar. That's kind of how they, play somewhat. They do have guys that are, will come in and step up, but not necessarily on a game, play-by-play basis. It's usually kind of like when a guy goes down to injury that you see someone step up, like in Akeem Ayers, when Gerard Mayo went down. But the Seahawks, they do it, like I said, from one play to the next. You got a whole other personnel out there. But that's the thing. The Patriots, I expect to see them, using some no huddle and trying to keep the Seahawks stuck in a package and, try to utilize that. Would not be surprised at all to see, Brady out of the shotgun, out of the no huddle, just running a quick offense, a la Jim Kelly and the Buffalo Bills back in the 90s. But even that's something you saw, other teams have success with against the Seahawks. Even in that conference championship game, Aaron Rodgers and the Packers, until the final, 3 minutes, one of the most exciting 3 minutes in football ever, and going into overtime as well in the NFC conference championship game. But the thing with it is, what you saw, though, with the other 57 minutes to the game is different things where you can have success against the Seahawks. And that's the thing where the Patriots, are definitely deadly, is that the Seahawks, as deep as they are talent-wise on defense, the Patriots, with their offense, is so versatile that they can come at you any which way. You never know what to expect from the Patriots because they have so many weapons, and they game plan, from one game to the next totally different. It's not like the traditional teams of the past where they would run a set style and they would just always do that same thing over and over again. They were like, hey, this is what we're doing, try to stop us, we do it better than anybody else. That's not how the Patriots play. What they do is they adjust, and they're almost like a chameleon. Like, they will, go from one style of play to the next based off of situations, based off of who they're playing, who's their opponent, and also based off of what's happening in the game itself. I mean, we saw in the AFC Championship game, of course, it's all infamous now with all the Deflategate and everything. But if you saw in the first half when the questionable deflated balls were in there, it was 17-7. In the second half, when there was no question about, the air in the balls, the Patriots just dominated. They came out in the second half and they shut down the Colts and they just run roughshod over them. And they just played almost a whole different game in the second half as they had in the first half, because that's the thing. They make those halftime adjustments, and that'll be interesting to see, where this game is at going into halftime. And it's a long halftime too. It's not like a traditional, football game, because you have the big halftime festivities and everything, Katy Perry and all that. That takes a lot of time. That takes up almost a half hour. It takes up a good solid 15-20 minutes. At least at about a half hour. That gives both teams plenty of time to study, the footage and everything from the first half as they're, that kind of stuff is going on. They got their coaching staffs looking at it in the game while the game's happening, but then now you give them all that time in the locker room to game plan to come out what they're going to do in the second half based off of the first half. Well, it's going to be pretty tough to beat the Patriots in the second half, given what, all that time they have going back out there. Although, the Seahawks, it's possible they might just out-physical them, because that's kind of what happened in the last couple of Super Bowls for the Patriots. Just the team they were matched up against, that was the Giants, the last two times. They just went out there and they were more physical. And the Seahawks do have the team that could potentially do that, although where the Patriots are very physical is in the tight end position. That's Rob Gronkowski, and he's definitely going to be a key in this game. Is going to be how productive Gronk can be and how much they can get him involved in the game and get the ball to Gronkowski. Of course, it's going to be up to Cam Chancellor to try to shut him down, and Cam, if anybody can do it, Cam can. But that'll be definitely a matchup to watch, and it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out. And if we actually look to see, head-to-head how these teams have, matched up in the past, well, they haven't really faced off that often, and especially with the realignment and everything, the way it's set up, is that teams only face each other once every 4 years, so they've only played each other 3 times in the last 10 years. But if you look at that, I mean, 2 of those games were with quarterbacks that, Brady was, there for the Patriots, but Russell Wilson wasn't in the league. So then really you only have one game that you can look at, and that was back in 2012 on October 14th when the Patriots went against the Seahawks. That was in Seattle, and it was a tight game. It was a 1-point game. Seattle won that one 24-23. And I expect to see a similar type of game this time around as well. So I think it is going to be a tight game. It's going to come down to the wire. I think the difference, though, is that it'll end up being 26-24 Patriots with that Gronkowski field goal at the end. At least that's what I think is going to happen. So I think it'll be tight, throughout. I mean, usually in the Super Bowl, we'll see one team jumps out to a quick lead right away. Maybe they get up by double digits, 10-0. It happens a lot. But then the other team starts battling back. They start getting in it. And as long as the Patriots can keep it within striking distance going into halftime, I almost think the Patriots would be better off to be trailing by a field goal at halftime. That would do them better. But, of course, I'm sure they would much rather just be winning the whole game, right, and have the lead at halftime. But I wouldn't be surprised to see the Seahawks go in the locker room with the lead. But it'll be a question if they can actually close out. Of course, in the conference championship game, you saw that they were getting dominated by the Packers, except that it was somewhat deceptive because they were hanging in there. Even when they were down, double digits and everything, they could have been a lot worse. They should have actually been down 35-0 at one point, but they were able to hold, the Seahawks were able to hold the Packers to field goals, even that Sherman interception early on and they were, getting turnovers, even though Russell Wilson had those 4 interceptions. Seattle kept, taking advantage and causing turnovers and making, their own luck. And they held in there, and they were able to still be within striking distance, and they pulled off what, is close to a miracle. I mean, you don't really expect to be able to get that onside kick, but they did it. And then they ended up going to overtime and winning that game. Of course, part of me thinks that that game right there was almost such an emotional high for the Seahawks. It was almost like their Super Bowl already. I mean, you saw the way after that game, all the players were crying. They were just emotionally drained. That right there will take a lot out of you, take a lot out of a team. I mean, they have had 2 weeks now, and that kind of plays in their favor. I think if it had been played last Sunday, that might have actually been a little too much for the Seahawks to, that quickly bounce back from such an emotionally draining game. Of course, we had all the controversy all week long, too, so I don't know if that really would have played well for the Patriots, and who knows how that would have worked out. But here we are, just 48 hours away from the Super Bowl. Of course, that depends when you're watching this. The Super Bowl might be over by the time you're seeing this, depending on when you catch it. It will be up, though, obviously, before the Super Bowl. But with that game being so emotional, like I said, it takes a lot out of a team to be able to come back and to send it into overtime and to win in overtime the way they did. Like I said, it's such an emotional high. I don't know if they are able to then get up for this one, even though you feel like, well, how can you not get up for the Super Bowl? But coming off of that, such a peak, how do you then go back to such a high level, of performance? It's going to be tough to do. Whereas, conversely, with the Patriots, they dominated the Colts. I mean, like I said, it was 17-7 going into halftime. In the second half, they shut them out. I mean, Brady even came off the field. There wasn't really any question that they were going to win. So, I mean, they were already, in the third quarter looking towards the Super Bowl, looking for, towards that Lombardi trophy, that prize. That was on their mind. Whereas the Seahawks, they did not know that they were going to make it to the Super Bowl until, Baldwin, or Curse, as it were, and caught that touchdown in overtime. I mean, when there was 3 minutes left, they had to have been feeling like, oh, geez, I can't believe we didn't make it. And then, magic happened in the form of Russell Wilson and beast mode, and, of course, that onside return, and really a overall effort from all 52 players on that team. But, how is that going to play into things? Only time will tell. We'll have to see. Like I said, they both had a couple weeks now to where I don't think it will be as big of a factor as I initially thought, coming right off of those games. Of course, a lot seems to have happened the last couple weeks. Just, we've seen through the media and everything, the whole Deflategate and all that. I mean, when it first, the dust had settled after the conference championship games, most people were going with the Patriots, but then you had all the controversy in the media and all that hype, and then all of a sudden everybody turned around, and all of a sudden it seemed as if everybody thought Seattle would win. But then as the time kept moving and progressing, and we got past the Pro Bowl, then it started to seem to shift a little bit back towards the Patriots, to where now, where is public opinion lies, seems kind of up in the air. Of course, that really is neither here nor there. It doesn't really matter, what people think's going to happen, because it's not as if that has any kind of bearing on the game whatsoever. But it'll definitely be one for the ages, as both these teams are looking to solidify their legacies in football. As the Patriots, if they win this game, Tom Brady will, without a doubt, be the greatest quarterback. Definitely, he's already in the argument, but at that point, it comes down to, I really think you have to just say, is it Brady or Montana? Once Brady, if he can win his fourth. And then with the Seahawks, on the other side, they win this game right here, we start putting them in the argument of the best defenses, especially after the way they beat Peyton last year in the Super Bowl, and that they could beat Brady this year, well, then they beat the two top quarterbacks of the era, and not only that, Russell Wilson, if he can get another ring, now you have to start putting him in the conversation, because now at that point he's doing, things like he's winning the way Brady won early in his career, or even, I guess you put Roethlisberger up there, who got a couple of early rings as well, and even Eli Manning. But I would actually put, Russell Wilson, if the Seahawks win this one, you got to put him above Roethlisberger and Eli, and put him up there kind of in that Brady conversation. And not only that, we got, Pete Carroll. He used to be a coach in the Patriots. He was the coach for the New England Patriots. That was after Parcells had left, and Parcells went to the New York Jets, and Belichick was the defensive coordinator back when the Patriots faced the Packers back in the 90s, 96. Of course, that famous Desmond Howard, kick return that was like a dagger through the heart. But, Pete Carroll, he was the coach in New England. Belichick was then with Parcells in New York, and then Parcells, he stepped down, and it seemed at the time as if Belichick was going to take over the reins in New York and become the head coach of the Jets, but instead he spurned the Jets and went to New England. He went back to the Patriots, who had at that time already gotten rid of Pete Carroll. Of course, I thought Pete Carroll kind of got the short end of the stick in his time in New England. I always liked Pete Carroll when he was the Patriots head coach. I didn't really think it was fair the way that people got on him, and how they I thought he left earlier than he really should have. I thought he was a much better coach than people gave him credit for. And I said that at the time, although I was just a kid. But, even still, he went on to prove himself in the college, had great success at USC, and now he's brought the Seahawks to their second straight Super Bowl, where he's facing off against arguably one of the greatest head coaches ever. He's definitely got the most playoff wins, as he actually passed Tom Landry. I believe he passed him. He's either tied or passed Tom Landry for the most playoff wins. That's Bill Belichick. So right there you got a little bit of a storyline going between Carroll and Belichick. And of course, if Pete Carroll, he's already, like I said, had a success down in the collegiate level. He won the Super Bowl last year. You got to put him up there in the conversation, especially if the Seahawks can win the Super Bowl for the second straight year. That puts Pete Carroll in, elite status as a head coach. Like I said, he's already one of the best. But let's look at the schedules of these two teams. And actually, heading into this game, the Patriots have won 5 out of their last 6 games and 8 out of their last 10. The Seahawks, conversely, though, they have won 8 games in a row and 9 out of their last 10. There was no team hotter than the Seattle Seahawks at this point. Heading into this game, there's only the 2 teams, but even heading into the playoffs, they were the hottest team, and they continued with that momentum. They continued pushing forward. They beat the Panthers. Of course, that wasn't really that, difficult of a task. They handled them pretty well, although Carolina did give them, somewhat of a game, but it was pretty easy for the Seahawks to get to the championship. But they did not have an easy game in that conference championship, and rematching against the Packers, who they had beat pretty decisively way back on September 4th in Week 1, and that was the season opener. They beat them by 20 points, but then they were down by nearly 20 in that game, and like I said earlier, they pulled off that miraculous comeback to get to the Super Bowl. Whereas the Patriots, that game against Buffalo, where that kind of broke up their winning streak, if it hadn't been for that game where they didn't even really play their starters, they would have been on a 6-game winning streak at this point, and also have won 9 out of the last 10. So I don't know if you really even can say that they're not any hotter or playing any better than the Seahawks. Both these two teams had very strong finishes in the second half of the season, even though there was, early on, say back on October 1st, not a lot of people were giving these two teams much of a chance to make it this far. But here they are in January, and they're going to be playing this game on February 1st, but they're the only teams playing in February. But if we go back all the way back, I said, and look at the whole schedule. The Patriots start off in week 1 with a loss in Miami. They bounce back with a win in Minnesota. Then they played their first home game. That was a win against Oakland. It was actually a tighter game than you would have thought. Then on Monday night, they lost to Kansas City. And that was the game right there. They got blown out on prime time against the Chiefs in Arrowhead. And a lot of people were saying, oh, the Patriots dynasty is done. Brady should retire and all this nonsense. You can actually go back to our upon further review for the Cincinnati game that they would play in week 5. And I actually was saying, no, the Patriots aren't done. Are you crazy? Like, the Patriots never lose 2 games in a row, and they weren't about to start, in 2014. And they bounced back in week 5 with a huge win over the Cincinnati Bengals, who at that time were actually considered to be one of the, forerunners for the Super Bowl and for the AFC Conference. But they dominated the Bengals. Then they went to Buffalo. They dominated the Bills. Then they played a game on Thursday night in Foxborough against the Jets. It was a tight game. And that's the game, I think that the Seahawks were looking at the tape of that one, because the Jets have somewhat of a similar style towards the Seahawks, and that the Jets have a really excellent running game and a good defense, a really underrated defense. Any defense coached by Rex Ryan is going to be a good defense. Like I said, the Jets' defense is really underrated. So that game right there, you saw that the Jets were able to actually make it very competitive in the way that they were able to shut down the Patriots on the ground, and then the way, they almost pulled it off. So that's, the way they were able to control the clock with their running game. They said that's kind of the recipe for success against the Patriots. But in week 8, against the Bears, also in Foxborough, they came out and they dominated the Bears 51-23. Brady had his best game of the season. And then in week 9, against the Broncos, again in Foxborough, Brady put up big numbers once again. So did Gronk in both those games. And the Patriots put up 43 on the Broncos, and they beat them by 22. And at that time, the Broncos were looking very strong. They were looking like they were going to be headed back to the Super Bowl until they ran into the Patriots at Foxborough. The Patriots then had their bye week in week 10. Then in week 11, they went to Indianapolis, and the Colts were looking really strong too. But in that game, the Patriots went in there and they just dominated them, beat them by 22, 42-20. That's when Jonas Gray had a monster game. He had 4 touchdowns, over 200 yards. And that's the name, you wonder, is Jonas Gray going to end up showing up in the Super Bowl? We haven't really seen much of Jonas Gray since that game. He's somewhat of a secret weapon for the Patriots. And I was actually thinking that we would see some Jonas Gray in the playoffs, but we haven't seen him yet. So you got to wonder, will we see Jonas Gray in the Super Bowl, or is he going to just still be LeGarrette Blount? I'm a huge LeGarrette Blount fan. I've always liked LeGarrette Blount all the way back to his days in Oregon as a Duck. But I'm interested, are we going to see some Jonas? Will Jonas Gray be an X factor? Will he be like a Timmy Smith, a guy that is flying under the radar, no one really expects to see or see much out of, and then all of a sudden he comes in here and has a huge game? I would not be surprised if that happens, although we might not even see Jonas Gray, so who knows? Like I said, I thought we would have saw him, in the divisional game or even in the conference championship against the Colts in the rematch, but they didn't even need him in the game. So, he did get a little play last week, or 2 weeks ago, as it were, but, will he get into the Super Bowl? Only time will tell. In week 12, they ended up back in Foxborough, and they beat up on the Lions. And that was pretty impressive, especially with how, excellent the Lions defense, one of the best defenses in football. Definitely a top 5 defense this year. But they put up 34 points against them and held them to just 9. They then went to Green Bay, and it was one of the best games of the season. And you can ask any fan of the NFL, and they'll tell you that. Of course, the Patriots lost that game, but it was a close one. It came down to the wire, 26-21. And that was the team who the Seahawks beat to get into the Super Bowl. So then in week 14, they ended up going to San Diego. They bounced back off of that loss. They beat the Chargers by 9. And then they ended up hosting the Dolphins, who they had lost to in week 1, but they avenged their week 1 loss with a huge win over Miami, 41-13. And then in week 16, they beat the Jets as they swept them in the season series. Because, again, it was a close game. They beat them by just 1 point, and they beat them by 2 points back in week 7. And then week 17, they didn't really play their starters. They kind of gave Buffalo that one. And so they split the season series with the Bills. But then in the divisional playoffs, they had a tough game against the Ravens. That was, a close one. They won that one by 4 points. Brady put up nearly 400 yards. And they advanced to the conference championship. And so then they went up against the Colts in the rematch. And it wasn't even anywhere near close. I mean, they put up 42 the first time around. This time they put up 45. But they only allowed 7. So they beat them by 38 points, and they had beat them by 22 the first time. So they dominated the Colts, and now they're in the Super Bowl. So Seahawks started off in week 1 with the match against the Packers. That was the first game of the season. That would end up being the last game for the NFC, or for an NFC versus NFC team in the conference championship. So it came full circle. They first matched up back on September 4th, and then they ended up having the rematch on January 18th, just 2 weeks ago in the conference championship. The first time around, though, the Seahawks were able to win by 20 points, and then that's how they started off the season. They then went to San Diego, and they lost by 9 against the Chargers, and conversely, the Patriots actually beat the Chargers by 9. Of course, that was much later on in the season. But in week 3, we had a rematch of Super Bowl 48 as the Broncos went to CenturyLink, and they faced off against the Seattle Seahawks. That game went to overtime, and that was quite the doozy, as the Seahawks were able to pull that off with a run in overtime by Beast Mode Marshawn Lynch as he won that one. Of course, the Patriots against the Broncos, they dominated them and beat them by more than 20 points, as we just mentioned a moment ago. So the Seahawks had their bye week in week 4. Week 5, they went to Washington. They beat the Redskins on Monday Night Football in a game that was not nearly as close as the scoreboard indicated, although they did win by double digits. And Russell Wilson had over 200 yards passing and over 100 yards rushing. But then in week 6 and 7, they lost back-to-back games. That was kind of the down point in the Seahawks season, as they lost to the Cowboys. That was in Seattle, the only loss they had at home all year. It was the close one, too. They lost by just a touchdown. Then in week 7, they went to St. Louis against their division rivals, the Rams. They lost by just 2 points, as that made it back-to-back losses. Russell Wilson had over 300 yards passing and over 100 yards rushing in the game. And a controversial call on a fumble cost them the victory. Although, if you lose by, one bad call, did you really deserve to win? But in week 8, they started what would end up being a stretch where they won 3 games in a row, and they would end up winning 9 out of 10 to close out the season, as they started off by winning in Carolina against the Panthers. At the time and most of the season, you think, oh, that's not really that big of a deal. But it actually ended up being somewhat, as they won their division. They actually ended up rematching in the divisional round of the playoffs. And the first time around, they won by 4. Of course, in the rematch, they ended up beating them by much more. So they ended up beating them by 14 when they faced them, in January, on January 10th. But back on October 26th, it was a 4-point game. Then in week 9, they ended up hosting the Raiders, and that was a game that was actually pretty close. So the Raiders played both these teams in the Super Bowl pretty close. So if you're a Raiders fan, that's something to take solace in, I guess. And the Raiders actually put up 24 points against the Seahawks. Of course, that was back in week 9. Then in week 10, they hosted the Giants, beat them by double digits. In week 11, though, they went to Kansas City. And that's another thing. If you're a Chiefs fan, I guess you could, your claim could be, hey, we beat both these teams. As the Kansas City Chiefs beat the, Patriots, they dominated them, actually, on that Monday Night Football game back in week 4. And then in week 11, they ended up beating the Seahawks in what was a very close game. It was a tightly contested game. One of the games of the year, actually, right there with that Packers-Patriots game that we had mentioned. Was that Chiefs-Seahawks. It came down to just 4 points, and it could have went either way. It was one of those games where it was a shame someone had to lose. If someone has to lose, someone has to win. unless you tie. And they didn't tie, and the Chiefs ended up winning that one. But the Seahawks have not lost since. That was November 16th, the last time the Seahawks were in the loss column, is they would end up winning the next 6 games to finish off the season. They beat the Arizona Cardinals. That was in Seattle, and that was at a time when they needed to pretty much close out, with all wins if they were going to catch the Cardinals, and they needed to sweep them, and that's what they would do, and that started off with that win in Week 12, and they still had both games against the Niners, and they needed to sweep the season series with them as well if they were going to win the NFC West, as the Cardinals had a pretty decent lead at that point. But they went into San Francisco and they beat the Niners. Both those games were 19-3. Then in Week 4 they went to Philadelphia, and at the time the Eagles were looking to win the NFC East, but that loss against the Seahawks really, put them down. They'd already also had that loss against Green Bay, and they never really bounced back after losing to the Packers and to the Seahawks. So the Cowboys were able to eventually win the division, and they did beat the Seahawks earlier in the year, and that was part of it. But in Week 15, they faced off against the Niners for the second time, this time in Seattle. And that was the conference championship last year, was the Niners and the Seahawks. But in 2014, the Seahawks swept the season series against the San Francisco 49ers. Then in Week 16, they went to Arizona, and that's where this Super Bowl is being played, so they're definitely familiar. They play there once a year. And in this game, they dominated the Cardinals in a game they had to win. Of course, the Cardinals were not full strength, but even so, they still went in there. They dominated them 35-6. They actually avenged their one loss at home from 2013, which was against Arizona, and they swept the season series against them in 2014, and that's why they were the NFC West champions, and that's why they're the NFC champions, and that's why they're in this game, and not the Cardinals. And so in Week 17, they finished off strong with a win against the Rams as they avenged their earlier season loss back in Week 7, and they ended up beating the Rams, so they ended up in the division being 5-1 against their division opponents as they swept the Cardinals and the Niners and split against the Rams. And then in the divisional round of the playoffs, they beat the Panthers. First they beat the Panthers, then they beat the Packers. So, they beat the Panthers pretty decisively, and then that game against the Packers is one for the ages. Is somehow, some way they pulled off that miracle. You almost wonder if he would make some kind of friggin' joke about the Wizard of Oz here, but anyway. So they pulled off that miracle. Must have clicked their slippers 3 times, I don't know. But they, somehow, some way beat the Packers, and it really did look like Green Bay was headed back to the Super Bowl, but it was not to be. As they pulled off that miracle, as we talked about a decent amount here, and I'm sure you're all very familiar with that game. So they've replayed it quite a bit, actually, and I've watched it more than once, to tell you the truth. But let's look at the numbers actually real quick before we wrap things up. Just go over the stats for the players heading into this game, or for the 2014 season anyway. And Russell Wilson, he had 3,475 passing yards on the year. He had 20 touchdowns and just 7 interceptions. And he also had 849 yards rushing, along with 6 touchdowns on the ground. So a phenomenal season for Russell Wilson. Almost 1,000 yards on the ground. He was the 15th leading rusher in the NFL. And that's among all players. So very impressive. And then Marshawn Lynch had 1,306 yards and 13 touchdowns on the ground. He was, I believe, number 2 overall in rushing, and he also had 367 yards receiving, along with 4 touchdowns receiving, to give him a total of 17 touchdowns on the year. Their leading receiver was Doug Baldwin. He had 825 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. He had 66 receptions. And Jermaine Kearse also had 537 yards and a touchdown. And Marshawn Lynch was actually their 3rd leading receiver, to be honest. Luke Wilson had 362 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns on the season. And their leading tackler was KJ Wright with 107 tackles on the season. And Bobby Wagner also had 104 tackles on the season, so they both had over 100 tackles. Earl Thomas almost had 100 tackles. He had 97 tackles. Cam Chancellor had 78. And then as for sacks, Michael Bennett had 7 sacks. Bruce Irvin had 6.5. Cliff Averill had 5. Jordan Hill had 5.5. And as a team, they had 37 sacks. And as for interceptions, they had 13 interceptions as a team. And of course, Richard Sherman led the team with 4 picks. And Maxwell and Irvin each had 2 picks. So that's the stats for the Seahawks. Let's go over the Patriots real quick. Tom Brady had 4,109 passing yards, 33 touchdowns, and just 9 interceptions. Of course, he only had 57 yards on the ground and no rushing touchdowns. The leading rusher actually for the Patriots was Jonas Gray. He had 412 yards, 201 of which came in that game against the Colts back in, what was that, week 12, I believe? And then he had 5 touchdowns on the season, 4 of which were also in that game against the Colts. But Shane Vereen had 391 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. And LeGarrette Blount, since coming over from Pittsburgh, has had 281 rushing yards and 3 touchdowns as a Patriot. And Rob Gronkowski is the leading receiver, although he is a tight end, but he has 1,124 receiving yards and 12 touchdowns on the season to be the leading receiver for the Patriots. Julian Edelman had 972 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns, and Brandon LaFell had 953 receiving yards with 7 touchdowns. And Shane Vereen actually had 447 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns to go along with his 491 rushing yards. So Shane Vereen, is kind of an X factor, somebody who's been kind of flying under the radar as well, and not really been talked about much by myself or anyone really for that matter. So don't be surprised to see Shane Vereen be somewhat of an it factor in this game. And when we look at defense, the leading tackler for the Patriots was Jamie Collins. He had 116 tackles. He had 4 sacks and 2 interceptions. And Donta Hightower had 89 tackles and 6 sacks on the season. And the leading sacker was Rob Ninkovich. He had 8 sacks. Chandler Jones had 6 sacks. Ayers had 4. And as a team, the Patriots had 40. So they actually had more sacks than the Seahawks. And when it comes to interceptions, Jamie Collins, Devin McCourty, Darrell Revis, and Logan Ryan each had 2 interceptions. They all tied for 2, and they had 16 as a team. So they actually had more sacks and more interceptions than the Seahawks. Actually, let's look at fumbles. We look at forced fumbles. The Patriots had 16 forced fumbles, and they recovered 9 of those. And we look at for the Seahawks, they had 20 forced fumbles, and they recovered 10. So the Seahawks recovered 10 fumbles, the Patriots recovered 9. The Seahawks had 13 interceptions, the Patriots had 6. So the Patriots actually had 2 more turnovers that they caused on defense. Of course, let's see, the Seahawks lost 2. Let's see, that's 2. That's 4. So 7. That's 11 turnovers that I'm seeing here on offense for the Seahawks. We got 1. 10 turnovers for the Patriots that I'm seeing anyway. I might be wrong here, but so actually the Patriots had 1 less turnover. So when it comes to turnovers, the Patriots protect the ball better than the Seahawks, and that's another thing. It's a slight advantage, but that slight advantage I think will make the difference. Is these 2 teams are pretty evenly matched. They said the Patriots, they're a team that you don't really know what they're going to bring to the table on offense, because they can pretty much do anything. They can come at you any which way. So it's kind of tough to say, what exactly they're going to do. They can open it up. They can, pass the ball. They can run the ball. We've seen that they have had success on the ground. Will they have success on the ground against the Seahawks? I don't know. They're going to need to. Definitely, especially when you consider that the Seahawks are going to be running the ball in this game. But in the end, I think the Patriots will pull it out. I think Gronk makes some big plays, especially in the second half. I think the Patriots come from behind to win it by a field goal, 26-24. That's the final score. That's what I'm saying. Let me know what you think. Those are my thoughts. Like I said, it could go either way. I would not be surprised to see either of these two teams win. It should be an excellent game to watch. I'm definitely excited to see it. But let me know what you think in the comments section below. Do you think the Patriots will win? Do you think the Seahawks will win? In this Madden game that we played, actually I totally dominated. I didn't even really see that coming. I was hoping it'd be a little bit closer, but I guess it's because I'm, being a Patriots fan, I'm pretty good playing with the Patriots. So if I had taken the Seahawks, I'm pretty sure I would have won as the Seahawks against the Patriots. But I took the Patriots, and you saw right there, it was 24-0 in the Madden gameplay. That's not what I think the game's going to be. Like I said, I think it's going to be 26-24. Although, that's just my ideas, It's not set in stone. We'll see what happens, but that's my pick. So let me know, as I said, your picks in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit the like button. If you want more content such as this, subscribe. As we're bringing you recaps and upon further reviews all the way through the season, all the way down to the Super Bowl right here. But we've also got some stuff coming up in the upcoming months and even upcoming weeks, as we've got a year in reviews for all the teams for the NFL. And we also have March Madness is coming up before too long. Baseball's coming back, and hockey and basketball are in the swing of things. So we'll probably do some basketball coverage, some all-star coverage, and it won't be long before the hockey and basketball playoffs are starting up, and we will definitely be covering those as well. So definitely keep an eye out for all that. Thank you very much for listening. It is greatly appreciated. I hope you're having a good day and have a great weekend, and enjoy all the sports.